Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was helping Mummy Pig water the plants in the garden, but the flowers seemed to wilt and turn black as soon as the water touched them. The vibrant green leaves shriveled, and the colorful petals curled inward, revealing thorny, twisted stems. The soil beneath their feet began to crack and crumble, revealing not earth, but a dark, pulsating mass. A low, rhythmic thumping sound emanated from deep within the ground, like a giant heart beating. The air grew heavy with the scent of decay and something sweet, yet sickly. The familiar garden gnomes, usually so cheerful, now had vacant, staring eyes, their painted smiles frozen in a grotesque rictus. The garden, once a place of beauty and life, was transforming into a barren wasteland. The thumping grew louder, and the ground beneath them trembled. Dark, thorny vines erupted from the cracked earth, snaking their way around the wilting plants, their thorns dripping with a viscous, black liquid. The sun, usually so bright, was obscured by a thick, unnatural mist that rolled in from the edges of the garden. The sound of buzzing insects filled the air, but these were not ordinary bees. They were large, black, and their wings beat with an ominous hum. The garden shed, usually a place for tools, now seemed to pulse with an internal, sickly green light. The plants, once their friends, were now turning against them, their thorny branches reaching out like grasping claws. The garden was no longer a place of growth, but of consumption, slowly devouring everything in its path. The thumping intensified, and a large, dark maw opened in the center of the garden, revealing rows of jagged, crystalline teeth. The house, their home, felt miles away, and the garden had become a living, breathing nightmare.
This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, Voices on the Second Floor. It was a late evening in the Pig family's house. The wind howled outside, rushing through the dark streets. Rain drummed against the roof, trickling down the windows in thin streams. Everything seemed like a normal rainy night, yet something in the air felt wrong. Peppa and George sat in the living room, wrapped in warm blankets. The television flickered with a silly program, but neither of them could focus on the screen. The house was too quiet. Even the sound of the rain felt muted, as if the walls had thickened. Then they heard it. Voices. They came from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking on the second floor and talking. But they both knew that Mummy and Daddy Pig had already gone to bed. Their door was closed. There was no one else in the house. Peppa froze. George clutched his dinosaur. The voices were muffled but clear. The words were indistinct, yet it was obvious that someone was speaking. A whisper, a quiet laugh, slow footsteps, the floor creaking under the weight. Peppa lifted her head, staring at the staircase. The second floor was swallowed by darkness. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the top step was sinking into a void. The voices didn't stop. They sounded wrong, like someone was pretending to sound familiar, but was failing. The voices grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. And then they began to descend. Step, pause, step, pause. Something was coming down. Peppa and George didn't move. Their hearts pounded so loudly that it felt like the whole house could hear them. But the worst was yet to come. When it reached the middle of the staircase, the upstairs light flickered. For a brief moment, they saw a shadow, tall, stretched, and completely still. The footsteps continued. The voices were right there. Peppa couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed George's hoof and squeezed her eyes shut. And suddenly, everything stopped. No more footsteps, no more voices, only silence. Peppa slowly opened her eyes. The top of the stairs was empty, but she knew that something was still there. It just didn't want to be seen.
The night was unusually quiet in Peppa Pig's cozy house. The silence was so heavy that even the creak of the floorboards beneath the blanket of sleep seemed too loud. And then it came, a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap at Peppa's window. She pulled the blanket tighter over her head, but her eyes stayed wide open with fear. It wasn't the sound of rain or the rustle of branches. This was different, intentional, as if someone knew she was awake. Suddenly, a shadow flashed across the glass. Light, stretched, but unnerving. And Peppa recognized it instantly. It was Ballerina Cappuccina. Only now she didn't look the same. Her usually elegant figure was withered, almost dried out. Her legs moved in jerks, and her eyes were locked on Peppa with a disturbing, relentless intensity. She wasn't knocking with her hands, but with the tip of a worn ballet slipper, and each strike sent a chill through the room. Tap, tap, tap. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, hoping it would stop, but the knocking grew louder. Now it sounded like a drum, setting a rhythm. Ballerina Cappuccina twirled just outside the window, her movements unnatural, a grotesque parody of her former grace. She spun and never looked away from Peppa, a silent invitation to come outside. At that moment, George stirred in his sleep and mumbled softly, "Peppa, make it stop." Peppa's heart tightened. She understood. If she stood up, it would become real. But if she stayed in bed, the sound would drive her mad. And suddenly, through the knocks and scraping, came a faint whisper, not from the window, but from inside her head. "You're watching this, aren't you? Press the HYPE button under the video." Peppa flinched. It felt like the words belonged to Cappuccina herself, as though her voice was woven into the eerie tune like a broken music box. For a second, it was clear. Someone was calling not just to Peppa, but to the one watching with her. The tapping didn't stop. It grew into a full symphony. Cappuccina struck the glass harder and harder, her movements becoming frantic. Her dress whipped like torn fabric, and with each pirouette she seemed closer. Even though the window was shut, Peppa could see the slipper leaving dents in the glass. "Peppa, join my dance," whispered Cappuccina. Her voice was sweet, like a lullaby, but within it was a coldness that pierced to the bone. George whimpered and turned toward the wall, while Peppa clutched the blanket, realizing this wasn't a dream. Then the lamp in the room flickered on, casting light on something even more dreadful. On the floor, right by the bed, footprints appeared. Tiny imprints of worn ballet slippers moving toward her. But Cappuccina was still outside the window. That meant only one thing. She could be in two places at once. The room filled with the echo of steps. The walls seemed alive, reflecting the dance. It was as though the entire space had become a stage, and Peppa the unwilling audience. But an audience with no choice. She would have to step onto the stage too. "One more step, and you'll stay with me forever," sang Cappuccina, her voice now coming from both outside and inside the room. The glass cracked. Peppa gasped and clutched George tightly. She knew one wrong move and the ballerina would be beside her, but staying still was unbearable. Then came the loudest strike. The window shattered into shards, and Cappuccina's slipper stepped onto the carpet. She made a graceful curtsy, her eyes flaring red, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. The music of the broken box filled the house, the walls trembled, and the shadows on the ceiling began to dance along with her. Peppa screamed, but the sound was drowned out in the monstrous symphony. Ballerina Cappuccina reached out a hand to Peppa. "Now it's your turn," she whispered, and Peppa understood. The knocking would never stop. The dance would never end. She was next.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Daddy Pig was in his study, engrossed in his newspaper. But the rustling of the pages sounded like dry, brittle wings. The antique globe on his desk spun slowly on its own, its continents shifting and blurring. A faint, musty smell filled the room. The ink on the newspaper began to bleed, forming strange, cryptic symbols. Daddy Pig seemed oblivious. The bookshelves appeared to lean precariously. A cold draft swept through the room. Peppa tiptoed to the study door. The familiar ticking of Daddy Pig /S watch had morphed into a slow, deliberate thumping. The air grew heavy. The symbols on the newspaper began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. Daddy Pig looked up, his eyes wide and unseeing. He spoke, but his voice was not his own. He gestured towards the globe, which now pulsed with the same green light. The continents on it rearranged themselves into a map of an unknown, terrifying place. The books on the shelves began to fall. The study was no longer a place of quiet contemplation. Peppa backed away, her heart pounding. The thumping of the watch grew louder. The green light intensified. Daddy Pig rose from his chair, his movements stiff and unnatural. The study door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The air grew thick with an unseen presence. The house was no longer a home, but a predator. The finality of her fate hung heavy in the air. The walls seemed to close in. There was no escape, no hope. Only the hungry silence and the unblinking eye of their doom. The house had claimed its prize, and the game was over. For now. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was taking a bath, splashing happily in the bubbles. Suddenly, the water turned murky, then black, and the bubbles began to pop with a sinister hiss. She tried to get out, but her hands slipped on the porcelain, as if the tub itself was holding her captive. A pair of glowing red eyes emerged from the black water, followed by a shadowy, elongated figure. It reached out with a long skeletal hand, its fingers tipped with sharp, black claws. Pause 30 seconds. Peppa screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the gurgling of the drain, which had transformed into a gaping maw. The figure pulled her deeper into the black water, its cold embrace tightening around her. She could hear faint whispers coming from the water, calling her name, inviting her to join its watery grave. The bathroom grew colder, and the shadows danced around her, making the distorted figure seem to come alive. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold touch on her cheek told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, the water was clear, and the figure was gone, but her reflection in the mirror was not her own. It was the shadowy figure, its glowing red eyes staring back at her, a sinister smile on its face. She knew she was trapped. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was her own reflection, now completely transformed, its glowing red eyes staring back at her. It was smiling, and then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim.
Peppa Pig, Uncontrollable Growth. It was an ordinary evening in the pig household. The sun was setting, casting warm rays through the windows of the living room. Peppa and George were sitting on the couch, flipping through a book of fairy tales their mother had given them. The atmosphere was calm, almost too perfect. But deep inside Peppa, a strange feeling began to build, as if something wasn't quite right. She put the book down and stretched, gazing out the window. The sky had turned darker, taking on a purple hue, and the first stars were beginning to appear. But as she stared at the darkening sky, she felt a strange sensation in her chest, as if her heart had skipped a beat. It felt like some sort of pressure, almost as if she felt uncomfortably full. Peppa stood up, rubbing her stomach. It felt like she had overeaten at dinner, but that wasn't the case. Her clothes started to feel tight. The sensation of pressure grew stronger, and she noticed something even stranger. She was growing. At first, it was only a little bit. Her legs tingled and her shoes started to feel tight, but she brushed it off as a trick of the mind. However, the strange feeling didn't go away. On the contrary, it only intensified. Her legs began to stretch. Peppa looked down in horror as her legs grew longer and her pants tightened around her body. She gasped, trying to call for her parents, but her voice sounded muffled, as though something was blocking it. And then she kept growing. Her legs stretched further and her body seemed to expand faster and faster. She could feel her arms and head elongating. She reached for the walls, but each movement made her grow even more. Peppa panicked, trying to steady herself, but with every step, she just got bigger. Soon she was taller than the house, and everything around her felt tighter. The ceiling cracked as her head scraped against it. The walls closed in around her, and Peppa couldn't comprehend what was happening. The world around her seemed so small. Even the floor, which had once felt solid, began to crack under her growing weight. With every step, Peppa became bigger, and it was harder and harder to control her body. Her movements were slow and clumsy, and she felt more out of control with each passing second. The furniture fell apart, the walls crumbled, and she couldn't stop growing. Everything around her felt smaller, and she felt like a giant moving through a tiny world. Peppa looked around in horror, trying to make sense of it all, but with each moment she felt more helpless. Her body, once light and agile, was now heavy and uncontrollable. She tried to crouch down, but her massive body didn't obey her. Her clothes and the walls around her squeezed in, and she continued to grow, unable to stop herself. As she was nearly bursting through the roof, she felt the house begin to collapse. The walls broke apart, and the ceiling flew off as if made of cards. Peppa stood there, her gigantic body blocking out everything. What was once her home was now destroyed and gone, crushed under the weight of her own growth. She sat in complete silence, surrounded by the ruins of the house, unable to understand how to return to her original size. Her body didn't obey her, and the world around her seemed too tiny and fragile.
Peppa Pig, Eyes in the Dark. In the pig family's house, an unusual silence reigned. Lately, George had hardly spoken to his sister. He no longer played with his dinosaur, didn't ask for bedtime stories, and didn't laugh the way he used to. Instead, he spent long hours sitting at the table by the window, clutching a pencil. Sheets of paper were scattered everywhere, on the floor, on the chair, even by the bed. All of them were covered with the same strange symbols, circles with short lines, resembling eyes. "George, what are these drawings?" Peppa asked cautiously. Her brother slowly turned to her. His gaze was unusual, heavy, and somehow too grown up. "You'll find out soon," he whispered, and bent over the papers again. Peppa felt her little hooves grow cold. George was becoming more and more withdrawn, as if his attention was fixed on something she couldn't see. One night, when they were both already lying in their beds, Peppa noticed that George wasn't asleep. He sat right on his sheets, staring at the ceiling. His eyes shimmered strangely, reflecting the moonlight. But there was no warmth in that gleam. It felt as if a bottomless depth was hiding inside them, one she could fall into. "George," Peppa whispered. He didn't answer. He only smiled, in a way he had never smiled before. The next morning, George's bed was empty. His favorite dinosaur lay torn to pieces on the floor. Above his pillow, on the wall, scratches had appeared. Symbols like eyes, as if someone had carved them with a sharp claw. "George!" Peppa called. But the room remained silent. She rushed through the house, searching for her brother in the garden, the kitchen, the living room. But George was nowhere. Everything around her felt too quiet, as if time itself had stopped. When Peppa returned to their room, her eyes fell on the large mirror hanging on the wall. Her heart froze. In the reflection behind her stood George. She spun around quickly. No one was there. But in the mirror, he remained, staring. His eyes glowed with a dim, sickly light, and his lips stretched into a smile. Peppa backed away, and then she noticed that next to George in the reflection sat Labubu. The toy looked almost the same as always, but its eyes flickered with a red glow. On its face lingered the same eerie smile as George's. "George is no more," came a strange voice from the mirror. It was low, drawn out, and echoed both in the room and inside her head. Peppa pressed herself to the wall. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The shapes of George and Labubu moved forward, toward the glass. Their outlines became sharper, as if they were about to break through. "No!" Peppa screamed. She dashed toward the door, but suddenly froze. In the mirror, her own bed reflected as empty. And on it sat Labubu, very close now, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. The mirror trembled, and the shadows nearly tore their way out. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look. When she opened them again, the mirror was ordinary. The room was silent. Only George's bed remained empty. Later that night, when their parents had gone to sleep, Peppa sat on her bed, staring at the shelf where Labubu now stood again. He looked harmless, soft and familiar, but now she knew the truth. His eyes were no longer lifeless buttons. In their dim glow flickered the same cold emptiness she had seen in George, and in the corner of the room, near the mirror, a crack was slowly spreading. It widened as if something unseen was watching from behind the wall. It all began subtly. Peppa was the first to notice that her little brother George had changed. At first, it was just small things. He became quieter than usual, stopped laughing, and played less with his favorite dinosaur. He often sat on the floor by the window, tracing shapes on the carpet with his fingers. At first, Peppa thought it was just a game, but then she realized the shapes were always the same. Circles, and in the center of each, two long stretched eyes. "George, what are you drawing?" she asked, trying to peek closer. But he didn't answer. His gaze was empty, as if he wasn't looking at the drawings at all, but sinking somewhere deep inside himself. With each passing day, it grew worse. George stopped responding to her words, ate less and less, and at night, Peppa heard him whispering strange words in his sleep. Sometimes he would get up and stand motionless in the middle of the room, his eyes fixed on the darkness. One evening, he finally looked up at her, and Peppa's heart froze. His eyes were completely empty. The smile stretching across his face was unnatural, alien. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered in a low, hollow voice. One that didn't belong to her brother, but to someone older, someone else entirely. And after those words, he simply melted into the darkness. Peppa screamed, called for her parents, but they only said she must have had a nightmare. The next day, George returned. He sat at the table, eating porridge, as if nothing had happened. But when Peppa met his gaze, he leaned toward her and whispered, "You're next." On the floor lay his dinosaur, torn to pieces, threads sticking out, strange red marks on its body, as if clawed fingers had ripped through it. Peppa could no longer pretend nothing was happening. She noticed something else. In the hallway mirror, George's reflection lived its own life. When George himself sat still, the reflection turned its head and stared at her. Sometimes its lips moved, and one day Peppa clearly heard, "He is already with us." No adult noticed anything. Mummy and Daddy said everything was fine, that George was healthy. But deep inside, Peppa felt it. Her brother was slipping away into somewhere else, and she was powerless to stop it. A few days later, he was gone for good. His bed was empty. On the pillow lay a piece of paper, the letters jagged and crooked. "He is with us now." Peppa clutched the note, her hands trembling. The house felt colder. The silence hung heavy and thick. That night she awoke to a strange sound. From the bathroom came a droning murmur, but it wasn't water. It was a melody, faint, hollow, as if played on an old radio. Peppa tiptoed down the hallway, each step echoing loudly. She pushed the bathroom door open and froze. Something was crawling out of the toilet. Its body writhed, slick with slime. Its eyes glowed red, and mingled with the bubbling sound was a dreadful melody. The same haunting tune, repeating again and again. Tralalelo, tralala. It seemed to sing, the sound spreading through the pipes, through the walls, straight into her head. Peppa gripped the doorframe, her whole body shaking. The creature was enormous, rising higher and higher, stretching its long arms toward her. Its head tilted to the side, moving slowly, and then it shook, as if to say, "You can't run." Peppa's throat went dry. She tried to scream, but no voice came out. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The thing slithered closer, its red eyes burning brighter, the melody swelling until it filled the entire house. Peppa stumbled back, step by step, until her back hit the wall. She knew this was connected to George, his disappearance, his words, the strange patterns on the floor. All of it led here. And then she saw him. On the shelf in the hallway sat Labubu, her favorite toy, always harmless before, but now his eyes glowed red and his smile was twisted. He didn't move, yet his gaze said clearly, "You're next." Peppa felt the cold seep inside her. She realized George had only been the first. Now, it was her turn.
This episode of the animated series, Peppa Pig, has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the Pig family's house, the wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside, but something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then, she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin, Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows, the walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig. Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the Pig family's house, the wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside, but something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then, she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows, the walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig. This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV.